Well, hello, Julius. Thank you very much for coming and speaking with me today and answering some questions about your research process and your research experience in finding your story. And you made a DVD with the help of Dr. Helga Thorson and Sharon Kim, which focused on your story itself. So, of course, today I would like to draw more focus to the actual research and the so-called behind the scenes, if I can use that word, about your research and finding your story. So my first question for you is, how did you come across a lot of these stories and the documents of your life? And did you actively go and search for them?
Um, in most of the cases, I did not look for them, but they came to me. For example, the first initiation that I had about my story was a plain brown envelope with the article in it. And that was completely out of the blue. I didn't know anything about my story. And I didn't have any interest in my story. I was relatively young, in my 40s at that point. And I had a good life and didn't want to start digging up things that might become very unpleasant to know about. And that changed when my daughter told me that she was pregnant. And I wanted to leave some sort of information for her or for her child. And at the same time, I also got an article showing that I was on a transport from Piotrków, where I was born, to Buchenwald. And that article, or that was a list of people that were transported, and my name was on it. So was my father's and my grandfather's name and two uncles. And that sort of made it very real for me that I had been there. And that was the big push that, okay, I want to find out more. And then after that, it came in dribs and drabs from different sources. I started reading about it. I started to talk to people that knew me, to talk to people that had been there. And it was really like undoing a sweater. You start pulling a thread and you get more and become more and more interested in it. And so I didn't really look for it in other forms than in books. The rest came to me.
That is very interesting. And can you tell me a little bit more about that article that you said you received? Who was it? Who was it by, and how did it come to you? When was the first time you read it? You said you were in your 40s, and then you pursued that article afterwards, and then of course you said your research and.
Well, the article was done by a man called Ben Giladi, and he was the editor of Piotrków Bulletin, which was a sort of information about people from Piotrków, and he lived in New York. His mother-in-law was my father's cousin, and she knew a lot of the facts that were in that article. And when I got that magazine, I decided, obviously, I have to go find out who she is and what this is all about. So I went to New York to meet them. And that's how it started. So Ben Giladi was related to me, but not directly, not very immediately. And going to New York was my response to that.
That too is very interesting. And of course, I mentioned at the beginning that you had made a DVD about your story, but some of these documents, such as the Ben Giladi article and other documents that you have shared with me personally, you did not include in the DVD itself. And so can you name some of these other documents? And why was this that you chose to include certain documents to use in the video over others? And what was your kind of process doing this?
Well, when I got the information about Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen, I actually wrote to them and said, "What information do you have on me?" And some of the forms and some of the documents that I shared with you are from them, and that sort of led one thing to another. Then eventually, I got invited to come to the celebration of anniversaries, and met other people, both from Piotrkov, but also that were on the same transports. And that way I gathered information. So talking to people with similar experiences. As you know, I don't remember anything because I was so young. But then I also did a 6-hour interview with Bergen-Belsen for their archives, and again met there other people that had been on the same transports. What did I look for? I think the only information that I was actively searching for was information about my father's death. And I still haven't found it. I haven't found where he died or how he died. I can follow it up to March of 1945, but then I come to a dead end.
When you were talking about how you were talking with other people that were on the same transports as you, and that is a way that you found a lot of your information, could you name some of these people that helped you along your journey? I know that you've mentioned to me Hetty or Yoram McCory were influential in this process. And how did exactly they help you in this research, and what did it reveal to you in terms of your overall story?
Well, let's talk about Hetty first. Hetty was one of the people that took care of me in Bergen-Belsen. And she and I became very friendly with her there. She was about 10 years older. She was about 14 at the time, and I was 4 or 3. And she took care of me. So she shared some of her experiences there, but also related to me. And then she wrote her book where she mentioned me, and that surprises me. So that was Hetty. With Yoram, it turned out that I had met him in 1960. I was 18 at the time, and I had absolutely no interest in my past. I didn't even know about my past. But he was related to me. He was my cousin, my blood cousin, on my mother's side. But I didn't know that. He did. I didn't. And the part that he brought to me was that his father, my mother's brother, had a very different name than my mother's maiden name. And it didn't make sense to me. Oh, why would that be? And I found out from Yoram that his father had changed his name when he came to Palestine in 1937 to sound more Israeli. And and that was one thing that he told me. The other thing was that his father had made an agreement with my adopted father, saying that he would not reveal the relationship between me and him, and neither would anybody in the family, because I stayed with them in 1960. So I was ignorant.
And when you finally discovered that you were connected to this family, how did that make you feel, and how did that contribute to your research as a whole?
Well, what it did was that his father, Sholem Makori, when he left Poland in the 30s to go to Holland to escape, he had taken with him family photos, a whole bunch of them, that Joram had. And when I found out about Joram sent me those photos. And those photos included photos of my maternal grandmother and grandfather, my uncles, and my parents, including a couple of them that had inscriptions behind them on the backside, written in Yiddish by my mother in her handwriting.
Wow.
So that was very meaningful to me.
That must have been amazing to see, and to kind of connect back to this family.
That's right. Yeah. To be able to see how she wrote, and it seemed like a very sophisticated way of writing.
Mm-hmm.
Because then I also compared her writing or her signature on the marriage certificate that I got of my parents. And her writing was sophisticated. My father's was scarecrow, sort of crow's feet type of writing. And so I think that was an intellectual difference between my parents.
What a amazing thing that you can put that together just from the writing on a backside of a image.
Right.
That's wonderful. And so beyond those two people that you mentioned to me, were there anybody else that you spoke to that helped you in your research and understanding your story that you haven't spoken of yet?
There have been a lot of people that have been incremental in telling me stuff, mm-hmm. including my two uncles in Toronto that survived the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. When I came to Canada in '66, I still wasn't interested in my past. And I wish that I had talked to them more. Their English was not that great. And when they were telling me stories, they sort of tended to be jumbled. And I didn't know how they connected to each other, how the stories connected to each other. Mm. So it was very difficult for me to follow through. But they did tell me of where I was when, and their role in my past. So that was one. Some people that were involved. I'm trying to think of others that I mentioned to you, Kobe, sorry. And he told me a lot of the things about the transport from Buchenwald to Bergen-Belsen, and also his mother, who survived the war. So there were people that I came across along the way that were incremental in filling out my story.
That's lovely. And you had mentioned to me as well before our interview here that you had met Bina and Annie, and they had helped you, or they had given you some documents. Could you speak a little bit to that story?
Yeah. When when I left Finland to come to Canada, my father gave me a bunch of documents related to the adoption. And what he had to do was to get affidavits from people to certify that I was an orphan and that I could be adopted. And one of the people that he got the affidavits from was Bina Ben-Kaim. She was my mother's cousin. And she ended up in Sweden after Bergen-Belsen. And that's where the affidavit came from. I was intrigued to slot her into the family tree. And she just didn't fit. There was no Ben-Kaim in the family tree. But I found out that that was her married name and that her maiden name was Corman. And I could find Corman on the family tree. So this was in 2010 that I found that out, that her name was Corman. So I wrote to Bergen-Belsen and said, I've got this correspondence with her from 1946. What happened to her? And they told me, well, she's living in Halifax. But we can't give you her address. It's confidential. So I said, all right, I'll write to the congregation in Halifax and see if they can give it to me. So I wrote this letter saying that I'd like to meet her, or I'd like to be in contact with her. And they looked at the letter and they absolutely thought that this must be a scam. So they gave the letter to her lawyer, who was taking care of her business end. And he didn't know what to do with it, but he decided to give it to her niece, who periodically came to Halifax to look after her, to make sure that she was doing okay. And the niece wrote back to me a very carefully worded letter saying, okay, sort of tell me more. And I did, and I convinced her very easily that I was genuine. I had letters written by Bina in her handwriting. And then I went to Halifax to meet Bina, and at the same time, Annie, her niece, was there at the same time. So we met and we became good friends. So that's another branch of my family that I didn't know about.
That's phenomenal, and must be so interesting too that throughout your research that you kind of keep bringing in different parts and different branches, like you just said, and that's so incredible that that happened, and you're able to visit her just because of a document that you had.
Right. There's also another one that I don't think I've told you, and that is Estera Jablonski. Sorry, her maiden name was Estera Feiner. And afterwards she became Tusha Jablonski. But as Estera Feiner, she was a neighbor in Pietrkov of my family. And one of the people on the magazine that I mentioned on the board was a guy called Henry Jablonski. And he had taken a trip to Piotrków with his mother. And his mother acted as a guide there and said, okay, you know, that's where the baker was, that's where the hairdresser was, and so on. And in that apartment up there was the Finer family. And when I read that, I wrote to him and said, can you tell me more about the Finer family? I've got these documents. And he said, yeah, sure. She's living down the street from me in Stockholm. So I contacted her, and she's really the one that directed me to Luba as well. But I went to Stockholm, and the other part about Henry Jablonski was that he was a psychologist. So we had dinner, and I mentioned to him that one of my best friends in school was a guy called George. I won't say his surname. And Henry stopped and looked at me and said, you know, I treated his son.
No way.
So,
wow.
So that was another sort of coincidence there.
Yeah. Very much what you were talking about at the beginning of our interview about how you come across these stories and parts of your, you know, your life, how you put it all together is just.
That's right. Yeah. That's been the interesting part of being able to react to information and digging a little bit deeper. Absolutely. And that, in fact, has happened this week. In that, on Facebook, there was I belong to a group of Piotrków survivors or families. And there was somebody that mentioned that there was a shtibel, which is a prayer house, at 13 Stara Warszawska. It was just sort of an offhanded remark. Mm-hmm. Now, if you look at the form I gave you, my admission form to Buchenwald, you'll see that my address there is 13 Stara Warszawska.
Wow, and that was just this week?
That was this week, so I contacted her.
Wow, that is incredible. And how, you know, kind of how lucky for us for our interview that happened.
Yeah, but those sort of things,
yeah.
That's why I'm saying that I haven't been looking for things. They just sort of fall into my lap.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that with me. That is very exciting for me to hear. And I'm sure that was just another one of those kind of crazy experiences, I'm sure, for you to, again, you know, like you said, just kind of come across these, not looking for them. Yeah.
Yeah, so the key to all of it, really, that I found is that you have to have a good memory of being able to see, hey, I've seen that somewhere before, and knowing where to find it.
Right.
And that has been a very great help.
Actually, that kind of leads into this next question in terms of memory, because you say, of course, that you don't have many memories from that time when you were younger. So having, you know, all these other people give you kind of this information is helpful. But you have mentioned to me before that you do have certain memories. And how did you feel when you found out that the information that you got matched those memories? What was that like for you? And can you tell me that memory?
Well, first of all, the memory that perhaps is the most vivid one, and the only memory that I can really say, yeah, I remember that, is that I remember being in an open cattle car. And I couldn't get any confirmation for that. The people that I insisted on asking people, you know, what was the transportation like from Piotrków to Buchenwald, from Buchenwald to Bergen-Belsen. And they all said that it was in closed cattle car. And because there were so many people that stated that, I thought, well, perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps it's a false memory. And then I found out that the transport from Buchenwald to Bergen-Belsen was in a passenger train. And that I found out from Kobe, whom I mentioned to you. Mm-hmm. So that really surprised me that they would transport us prisoners, we were 21 of us, in a passenger train. Mm-hmm. that would take us from a concentration camp. And all the other passengers, the Germans on the train, would see it.
Right.
So I pressed the archivist in Buchenwald and asking him, was that really right? He said, well, yeah, it was, but the train left not from Buchenwald, but from Weimar, which was 8 kilometers away. Mm-hmm. And okay, so I was on a passenger train from Weimar to Bergen-Belsen. How did I get to Weimar? And he sort of shrugged it and said, well, obviously in an open cattle car. And that is really the only firm memory I have. The other reaction I have is when I hear a certain lullaby. And eventually I found out that Luba, who had been taking care of me in Bergen-Belsen, used to sing it to us. And I found a recording of her singing it. And that was really sent shivers up my spine.
Yeah. And so how did that feel to you when, especially what you were talking about with the open cattle car, that memory that you have, how did that feel when the information that you got really solidified that memory? What was that like for you?
Well, it was a confirmation that I had a memory. Mm-hmm. And what I questioned was, why would that open cattle car be the only memory I have, considering what I had seen, what I had experienced, the hunger and so on. Why would that stay with me? And one of the archivists said, it must have been very traumatic for you and your father. And that I translated that anxiety, that fear, that emotion into remembering only the cattle car, not him. I don't remember him at all.
Thank you for sharing that with me. The last question I have is a little bit different, not necessarily those memories and having those memories confirmed, but through your information that you received in your research, what do you do if you ever receive conflicting information about your story? And do you have any examples of this kind of conflicting information that you may have come across throughout your research?
It's inevitable to get conflicting information. Mm-hmm. Because, first of all, a lot of the information is people's memories. And they are not that clear. They tainted their own way. And one example of that is the article, Ben Giladi's article. The outline of it is correct, but there are some details in it that are wrong.
Mm.
For example, one of the things that he is saying that is wrong is that I was in Block 66 in Bergen-Belsen. I wasn't. And the way that I got that right later was from Ken Walter, who is a researcher at Michigan State University. And I was in Hut 58.
Mm.
It's a small difference, but at the same time, it's something that struck me that you can't believe everything that you hear. And he could document it, and I can document it. If you look at my admission form to Buchenwald, there's a 58 in the first column.
Mm.
And sorry, not the admission form, but the transportation list has a 58 in it. And that was the block that we were assigned to. So there are small differences there. And I tend to, when I get conflicting information, I tend to look at, can I document it in any way? And I tend to believe documents more than I believe people's testimony.
Mm.
Unless it is very recent after the event. But yes, there are conflicting information that is inevitable to get. And another thing, for example, another example of conflicting information is what happened to my father. There are some people that have told me that he was killed in Buchenwald. And in January, which I doubt because he was on a transportation list in March. So information gets not intentionally changed, but it does get fuzzy.
Of course. And I think too, with all of that, that question of memory gets talked about quite a bit, but it's good that you have found, people and documents that have solidified that kind of factual evidence to those memories as well. Like you said, conflicting information does happen. It's kind of inevitable, and it does get fuzzy. So it's nice to kind of compare the two if you do have those documents next to those memories and testimony. I can only assume, I guess. But I think that was the last question I had. But I did want to ask if you had anything that you wanted to say to anybody about your story or your research or anything that you would like anybody to know.
Well, I think in my case, my story is unique of what I had gone through. But all the stories are unique. And what has kept me going is not the story itself, but finding out the story, of digging. And I like doing jigsaw puzzles. And that's what it is. Finding, like I told you about the prayer meeting, the prayer house.
Yeah.
It's just little bits that are really quite irrelevant, but give it shape.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what has kept me going. That's been the fun part. And it has been fun. it's been a challenge, but it's fun as well.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for talking to me today and sharing these bits that some people might not know. I'm very excited for everyone to hear this and to listen to it. So thank you very much, Julius.
Sorry, I just want to add one thing.
Please do.
And that is that I have tried to tell you things that are not in the video, very intentionally, because I've done a lot of talks, I've done a lot of interviews, and they are more or less for specific audiences, university students, high school students. But with the archives, I wanted to make it more complete, tell you things that don't really fit into the story. It doesn't fit into the narrative, but they're relevant.
Absolutely. Very interesting and informative as well.
So, thank you for doing this interview.
Thank you for being here.